Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here this morning. Glad to see you and encouraged by your presence. We're studying in Genesis in this Sunday morning class, and we are in chapter 21. Chapter 21 of Genesis, where we continue our study this morning. Last week we studied about the incident where Abimelech took Sarah, having been told that she was Abraham's sister rather than wife. And we talked about that episode last week. And I want to, just a sort of introductory, I want to apologize for letting our discussion sort of get off track last week. And we talked about some things that rather speculative in nature. Some of us talked afterwards and agreed that those kind of discussions probably are better in a different kind of setting than in a Bible class such as this. And so as the teacher, I apologize for letting that get off track in that direction. And also, it was mentioned that we want to clarify, nobody suggests or believes that men are not accountable for their sins. And there was a concern that maybe that impression was left. And we don't think that. Certainly all men are accountable for their sins. And so, again, we got kind of far-ranging in our discussion last week, and that's my failure as a teacher. So apologize for that. All right, right at the, in chapter 21, we talked about how Ishmael and Hagar were sent away, and that apparently was a grief to Abraham, but God made certain promises concerning Ishmael in chapter 21 down through about verse 21. And then we have just one more part of that chapter to discuss in Genesis chapter 21. Concerning a covenant, an agreement made between Abraham and Abimelech. Let's start reading there in Genesis 21 at verse 22. It came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of the host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now therefore swear unto me here by God that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me, and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. Let's stop there for a minute, just talk about, we've talked about this word covenant in our study of Genesis, and we've pointed out that the two parties agree to a covenant. It's not just a promise on the part of one, but an agreement between two. And in this case, the covenant is between Abraham and Abimelech. Seemed like maybe there's a couple of things that motivated Abimelech to want this covenant. Notice he said in verse 22, God is with thee in all that thou doest. And so Abimelech could see that God was blessing Abraham, and that being the case, he wanted to be maybe on Abraham's good side, you know. God is with this man. I need to make sure I'm right with this guy, because if God is blessing him, I need to make sure that I don't get, crossways with him, or there's some contention between us in one way or another. The fact that is mentioned, that Abimelech mentioned, God is with thee in all that thou doest, seems to be that was surely a part of his motivation. But I also wonder, notice there in verse 23, swear that thou wilt not deal falsely with me. Do you think that maybe that could have been generated by the fact that Abraham hadn't been honest with him before in the matter of Sarah? That Abraham had been less than totally honest with Abimelech. And in fact, as we talked about, he purposely told that business about Sarah with the intention of misleading Abimelech. So there's some thinking, at least, that was also a motivation on Abimelech's part. I want to be on Abraham's good side because he's God's man. I want Abraham to promise me that he's not going to deal falsely with me like he has in the past. The fact that he even brought that up makes you wonder if he wasn't thinking about that past episode. But for whatever reasons and whatever the motivation, Abraham agrees. Abraham swears to him in this regard. Now, at that time, Abraham had another concern that he brought up to Abimelech. Abraham reproved, verse 25, Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. And Abimelech said, I wot not who had done this thing. In other words, I didn't know about this. Neither didst thou tell me, neither yet heard I of it, but today. And Abraham took sheep and oxen, gave them to Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, what mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? And he said, for these 7 ewe lambs shalt thou take of my hand, that they may be a witness unto me that I have digged this well. Wherefore he called the place Beersheba, because they swear both of them. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba when Abimelech rose up and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba, called there on the name of the Lord and the everlasting God, and Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days. We know that we read often of the place Beersheba as we go through Old Testament history here, and here's the beginning of that name and what transpired there. I did a little reading about Abimelech. Now we're going to read about Abimelech again when we get on over into chapter 26. We're going to read about Abimelech there, and when we read about him there, Isaac does effectively the same thing that his father Abraham had done. In this case, Isaac is not telling the truth about Rebekah to Abimelech. And I had sort of always assumed it was the same Abimelech, but in doing a little bit of study of that, there's a pretty strong opinion that the term Abimelech was a title of Philistine kings. Of course, these were city-states still at that time. So I think this Abimelech we're reading about is the king of Gerar. There's a later place where there's a king of Gath, which were cities in the territory of the Philistines. But there's a thinking that Abimelech may have been a title. It literally means father king, and that it may have been a title similar to Pharaoh in Egypt. From what I was able to read, there's not conclusive proof of that, but a pretty strong feeling that the name Abimelech was a name given to the kings, and more than one wore that title. I'd always assumed that when we get to chapter 26, that the Abimelech there was this same Abimelech that dealt with Abraham. In chapter 26, he's dealing with Isaac, but it may not be the case. And so just something to think about there, that it may be one of those titles like Pharaoh, in this case given to kings in the region that will come to be known as the Philistines. These are cities of the Philistines, and these are kings that in generations to come, their descendants will comprise the Philistines. Any thoughts or comments? Okay. That brings us then to chapter 22, which is well remembered. It's a well-known episode. There's a couple of challenging parts to it. This is where Abraham is instructed to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. In chapter 22, we begin at verse 1. It came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I shall tell thee of. All right, now, couple of things. One of them, and I'm reading the King James Version, one of them is that it says God did tempt Abraham. And that usually causes some concern, because over in the New Testament, James chapter 1, verse 13, James chapter 1, verse 13, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. And so, the question is, have we got a contradiction in Scripture here between Genesis 22, where it says God tempted Abraham? James 1 verse 13 says God doesn't tempt anybody. I think the answer is in translation, right? And if you're reading a newer version like the New American Standard or the English Standard, the word tempted is not there. It's the word tested. God tested Abraham. That's the better understanding. We are tested anytime that a command of God is placed before us, right? The command, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins. You shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. Acts 2:38. Well, you're being tested, right? Are you going to do what God tells you to do? There's a test there. That's a test, right? And so God tests us constantly. Are we going to be obedient? Are we going to do what the Scriptures tell us to do? That's an ongoing test. God tests us. We're being tested to see if we'll be submissive and obedient to God. Abraham was being tested here. And so I think, although that has caused a lot of confusion through the years, I think it is just a question of translation. And the newer translations make it clear. Dale, did I see your hand? Yeah, I think almost all the new versions do. I think King James stands almost alone using the word tempted there. And it's better, the idea tested. Now, the other part of this that's a little concerning is a human burnt sacrifice. So God says to Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, get thee to the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering. Human sacrifice. Well, we know that as the Old Testament story continues to unfold, that human burnt sacrifice was an abomination to God. We will know later that in this same territory, this is the territory that the Israelites are going to come out of Egypt generations from now. The Israelites are going to come out of Egypt, and they're going to possess this land. They're going to drive out the inhabitants of this land because the inhabitants of the land were horribly evil and wicked. And one of their horriblenesses was offering their children as burnt sacrifices to their idol gods. And we're going to read that God hated that practice. It was the Old Testament word is it was abomination to him. It was abomination when they offered their babies and sacrifices. So have you got any issue here with God telling Abraham to do what he later is going to say that he hates and is an abomination to him? Any thoughts, Monty?
Necessarily been revealed to mankind, as far as we know anyway, that this was an abomination to God. But even so, if God tells us through direct revelation like he did to Abraham, if he was to tell Abraham to do something, then he needs to do it. We know as we read through the story that it was a test and God really didn't have any intentions of him carrying that out anyway. But ultimately, Jesus was a human sacrifice for us. And so there were cases apparently when that's what God required, and this was one of them. And he stopped him from doing it, but it was still a command from God. He still needed to obey it. And even if the other people around at this time were offering human sacrifices, if it was a command from God, that it needed to be done. And we know that this one instance, at least, was a command from God.
Okay. I think what you said is especially appropriate to consider here in regards to timing. In the timing of this, we haven't read anything yet. We're in chapter 22 of Genesis. So we've got all of history leading up to Genesis 22, and we haven't read anything about human sacrifices. So God has not revealed himself that he hates human sacrifices. I think there would be at least some concern that we got contradictory messages coming from God. If prior to this, he had said, I hate human sacrifice, and then he says to Abraham, make a human sacrifice. I think that that would seem like that God's contradicting himself. But there's no information leading up to this point in time where God had expressed himself as viewing that as an abomination. He will later. And we know how this story is going to play out. It's not going to even happen here, right? And so this was a test. I think a test that was in place before the problem of human sacrifice to pagan gods had become a big issue. So I think I'd base my answer to that on timing, the timing of these events, and the further explanation that it didn't really come to pass. We know that it didn't actually happen. Any other thoughts, Tina?
Good for us too, because it shows us that Abraham was fully committed to the covenant that he had made with God, and that he was willing to do whatever God had asked him to do. And I think we need to be that full committed to God when we make the commitment to serve him, that we are willing to do what he asked us to do, that we're all in.
Yeah, all in. Okay. I think that that's true, even if I don't understand why. So here's a command of God, and I don't get it. A lot of people make that argument about baptism. I just don't see what baptism's got to do with it. Why is getting dunked in water? Why is getting wet physically? How does that have anything to do with my inner man? I don't get it. And since I don't get it, I'm not going to do it. That's the way. That's the progression, the thought progression that a lot of people pursue. It doesn't make sense to me. I'm not doing it. Now, I think that we can make an argument for the sensibleness of baptism. There's a lot of symbolism there to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Romans 6 makes that very clear. But even if I don't see the symbolism, if that doesn't connect in my mind, bottom line is it's a command from God. I need to do what God commanded me to do, whether it makes sense to me or not. And so I think there is value to that way of thinking. So I had another thought, Dale.
Verse 2 there it says, take his only son, the son you love. In verse 1 there it says, God tested Abraham. This is a test of all tests right here.
Sure.
It shows how much that Abraham really thought of God, to do this is just, miraculous.
Yeah.
It's like God sacrificing his son. It takes a great will.
You're right. It was a test of all tests for Abraham, for sure. Tom?
Part two is God given Abraham already direction. He said, in this seed, all nations will be blessed. And, he told him, through Isaac, the people will come. So now, either, Abraham, you just sort of sit there, you go back on your word for it, you want me to do this, how are we going to work that? But, so it's, I think, important to see the growth of Abraham with the covenant and then believing what God told him to do to the point where he basically didn't question it, he just did it because God told him to do it.
Okay, I think you're right. There's a couple of New Testament references to this story that we want to look at in a minute. But let's just read how this goes on and plays out here in chapter 22. Let's keep reading there. Verse 3, Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son and clave the wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went into the place which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here am I, my son. And he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything to him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place Jehovah-Jireh, as it is to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. All right, so again, a really familiar story to us. We know how this turns out. But our author asks us to list the things that would have made it difficult for Abraham to obey this command. And then what do we learn about Abraham in the fact that he did obey the command? Well, verse 2, it's his only son, of course, his only son by Sarah. It's the son that he loveth. So his love for Isaac, the fact that it's his only son by Sarah, this is obviously, just obviously, without even any thought, we realize this would have been a very difficult thing for Abraham to do. But it's been pointed out, and I think it's really significant, that when he was told to do it, he didn't procrastinate or put it off. He rose up early in the morning and got everything together and started for the place that God had told him. You know, we don't like to get up early in the morning, especially to do things we don't want to do anyway. Now, we might get up early in the morning to go fishing or go hunting, us guys might. But just to get up early in the morning, especially to do something, to get up early to do something you don't want to do. But it's been that expression in verse 3 that he rose up early in the morning is really significant. Speaking of the faith and submissive obedience of Abraham. And notice that the travel from where they were to where God had told him to go, it wasn't just like going across town. It wasn't like going to the other side of Murray County. They traveled 3 days to get to the place where God had instructed him to make this sacrifice. 3 days would have been a lot of time to have second thoughts. And he kept on, and he went on. Joan?
Do you think maybe, this is all speculation, but rising up early, said he rose up early. If it had been our child, we would be ready to go and get
Sure.
and doing it at any time of the day.
Yeah.
But do you think his faith was so strong that just like he told his son, the Lord will provide?
I think this is definitely, this is excellent faith on the part of Abraham. And there's just no doubt. You don't have to stretch your imagination at all to imagine how difficult this command would have been to obey. Let's look at the couple places where this is mentioned in the New Testament. In James chapter 2. James chapter 2 is the text that we reference so often that talks about faith and works, that faith must be coupled with works of obedience. And in James chapter 2, beginning verse 20, Wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. So there's one place where this is mentioned. I think it's interesting that here in James chapter 2, verse 21, when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar. And so it was as though it was a done deal. In other words, he was not holding back. He built the altar, he laid out the wood, he tied Isaac up. It was as though he had done the sacrificing. It was there was no going back. God understood this. He's following through here. This is as though it is a finished act. And then look in Hebrews. Hebrews 11 gives a little bit of insight to what was going on in Abraham's mind. And I think this is interesting. Of course, we remember Hebrews 11, that great chapter on characters of faith and their acts of obedience. Faith and obedience again. But in Hebrews 11, verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he had received him in a figure. And so here the Hebrew writer gives us a little insight to what was going on in Abraham's mind. Now Abraham remembered that the promise had already been, not that through his seed would these promises come, but he had been promised that through Isaac these promises would come. It wasn't just a general promise, through thy seed these blessings will pursue. It had been a specific promise that in Isaac these promises would be fulfilled. Remember that in that episode about Ishmael and Isaac, and God said, no, it's not going to be Ishmael, it's going to be Isaac. So God had named Isaac as the child of promise already. And so the Hebrew writer says Abraham's thinking was, God can raise him up again. I mean, it was a miracle that we had him in the first place. And I think that's what he's referring to, that he could raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. In other words, he and Sarah were past the age of childbearing, but God gave him a son. If God can do that, God can raise him up after he's offered as a sacrifice here. His complete faith in God. One way or another, Isaac is going to lead to the fulfillment of these promises. Abraham believed that. And so his faith didn't waver, and he followed through. Now, I think the application of that to us is we're dealing with the same God, and when God makes promises to us, the promises that God makes to us are just as sure as the promises that God made to Abraham. Now, the question is do we have faith like Abraham that we will obey even when it doesn't look too good, even when the circumstances and the consequences do not look real favorable to me? Do we trust in God? Will we do the right thing even when it looks like this is the outcome of this is pretty bad? This is not what I want. Will we trust God? Thoughts or comments, Tom?
Here, one thing that comes out is Abraham evidently had been teaching Isaac about sacrifices and offerings to God, because, Isaac knew that we've got the wood, we've got the fire, all this.
Where's the animal?
So he had some understanding.
He knew sacrifices.
And then, there's things there that goes through, you think, did Isaac put up a struggle, or did he have faith in his father and faith in God to just render himself to that? That's another concept.
Yeah, Isaac's submissiveness is not even mentioned here, but did he fight his father when his father tied him up? It doesn't say so. And so again, we don't know, we'd be speculating, but you would think that Isaac himself is pretty submissive in the matter. How are you going to do in regards to God's instructions? Now think about it, this was a 3-day journey. So he gets up early to do a job he doesn't want to do anyway. And he has to travel 3 days to do it. Now, 3 days, how far are you going to walk in a day? 20 miles. 20 miles is a pretty good day's hike. So, did they go 50 or 60 miles? So, you have to walk 50 miles to go to church. You going to do it? God says not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together. So, the test is, you've got to walk 50, 60 miles to go to church. You going to go? Or are you going to say, that's too much. I'm not doing that. I'm not, that's extreme. That's an unrealistic expectation. I'm not. I think most of us probably would say I'm not, because a lot of times people won't even drive, in a comfortable automobile 5 miles to go to church. We're sure not going to walk 50 miles to go to church. You got to think about some of the application of that. It's pretty interesting, pretty challenging. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on this? Dale?
Greg had to give thought too. Abraham was an old man when he had Isaac, so you can think,
Now, actually, we know, I think you're right. We do know that he had other children subsequent to this. By Keturah, for instance, he had children. But, could the thought have been in his mind, could I even have another child? But even more than that, as we said, Isaac had been named as the promised son, that the promises were going to be fulfilled through Isaac. So God, you're messing up here, God, because you made some promises, and if I kill Isaac, God, I'm not going to do this because I think you, God, are not thinking right. You, God, have got something messed up in your thinking, God. I know better. And so I'm not going to do what you said because I think I know better than what you said. None of that was going on. James?
In Hebrews 11, we notice that he believed in resurrection. And we, with the benefit of the New Testament, after seeing Jesus and the resurrection that he did to other people in his resurrection, we think that's amazing. But just going back to think about Abraham, I don't think there was an instance where somebody was raised from the dead.
Yeah.
So just think about his actual faith. God could actually take some person who's dead and raise them up. And that's the only way that it could possibly happen if I sacrifice. That's how good his faith was.
Yeah.
We've seen instances of resurrection. I don't think he did.
Yes.
We have faith that he could. And that just shows his great faith.
I think that's a good point. When you study through the Old Testament, now I do think it's a mistake. I've heard people say in the Old Testament they didn't have any notion of eternity or life beyond the grave, existence beyond physical death. And I don't think that's true. I've heard people say that. And I think James's point is good here that Abraham here is demonstrating a faith in that sort of thing, although I'm sure his understanding of it, as James pointed out, is not near as clear as ours. We live in a time when this has all been very fully revealed to us, and Abraham didn't. But I think he did understand that existence doesn't cease at death. And there are those who claim that in the Old Testament. They all thought that, and I don't think that's true. All right, anything else here? Kelly?
I think it's a serious thing to question God. Abraham just obeyed his own questions. In Isaiah 45, verse 9, it says, "Woe to the one who quarrels with his maker."
Woe be to the one who quarrels with his maker. Don't you think Abraham could have done this? God, wait, hold up there just a minute now. I can't do that. Because if I do that, then you're not going to be able to do what you said you were going to do it. God, stop a minute here, God, and think about what you're asking me to do. It doesn't make any sense. And again, since it doesn't make sense to me, I'm not going to do it anyway. But God, you're really out of bounds here because what you're doing, he didn't offer any of those kind of arguments, no quibbles. He did just as he was told. Tom? I didn't stop figuring his age here.
Yeah, but, Abraham laid the wood on him. He carried it.
He was big enough to carry the wood.
And you weren't going on flat ground.
Yeah.
They were going up a mountain. There's some places that sort of think that this might have been the mountain where Jerusalem was built. And, the concept of Moriah and things there on that one. So, it was a steep climb to go up and to carry that burden as well.
Right. So again, Isaac wasn't a babe in arms. He was grown, and I don't know if we can figure his age or not. But as you said, one obvious thing is he's big enough to carry the wood for the fire. So, yes, go ahead, Jordan.
I think it's interesting. He gives the reason why he made him do it in verse 12, or asked him to do it in verse 12. He says, "For now I know that you fear God." How much do you fear God? I mean, that's what he was hunting for. I found that interesting. I wanted to see how much you actually fear me, and now I know you do.
Yeah.
Do we understand the fear of God?
And so obedience is the test of whether we fear God or not, right? So do you fear God? Everybody wants to say yes to that.
It's easy to say yes.
Yeah.
But our problem is we don't see the direct result. It's not immediate. We have time. God gives us time. Thank goodness, But Abraham didn't have time at that point. He was out of time. He was pressed against the wall. He had to do what he did. And I think it is killed my son.
Yeah.
And, but God says, well, now I know you fear me.
Yeah. But I think you're exactly right. And it would be to us. So I don't really understand this baptism thing, but I'm going to do it. And God says, now I know that you fear me because you obeyed me. I mean, when God tests us with commands, then He is able to determine whether we fear Him or not as to how we respond to His commands. That's what this is obviously extremely unique case with Abraham, but it's true for all of us. God is able to determine whether we fear Him if we're compliant and obedient. Tom?
Also looking at the age of Isaac too. You had that time to Sarah, after, she gave birth to what, 90, almost 90 when Isaac was born, so his face is, almost over 100. So if she was way past childbearing at that time, now she's way past. So, Abraham is thinking, God, you have to keep your promise, And this is the one you promised through, so, there's a...
And although he couldn't see how this was going to transpire, he just trusted. And sometimes we have to do that. We just have to trust even if we don't see how it's all going to transpire. All right, now I think it's interesting that right at the end of that, verse 15, the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time and said, by myself have I sworn unto the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed, as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. Well, that's a repeat of the promises that God had made earlier, right? In fact, those promises, we're now in chapter 22. I'm not exactly sure. I didn't calculate how many years have transpired, but this is a repeat of the promises made way earlier to Abraham. But notice, it sort of speaks to because thou hast done this thing. And he repeats the promises. Because you have done this, now I'm repeating my promises. You get the idea, and that goes to this notion of covenant. If Abraham at any point had failed to comply, then I get the idea that the covenant would be broken, don't you? Because notice, he didn't say, I'm going to bless you, and in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because I promised that a long time ago anyway. No, the because is because now you have done this. The promise is renewed, which speaks to the conditionality of a covenant agreement. Well, the covenant was contingent upon Abraham continuing to faithfully do the things God told him to do. Monty?
We see throughout history, God's promises have always been conditional on continued obedience. We see it in this example here with Abraham. When Israel becomes a nation, God's made all these promises to him. He's given them the land, but told him, as long as you keep my covenant, you'll have the land and everything will be good. But then when they don't keep it, they break his covenant, he tells them, because I told you to begin with, if you didn't keep it, I was going to punish you. He did. And we can see it on into the New Testament. Judas had the same opportunity as the other 11 apostles did. But he chose not to stay faithful and was punished for it. So it's been a continuing thing throughout history. God's promises have always been conditional on continued obedience. Obedience at the time and continuing on, as it says in Revelation 22, be faithful unto death. Not be faithful for the most part, but be faithful even if it means all the way up to dying. Be faithful and I'll give you a crown of life. So God's promises are conditional on continued faithfulness, and it's just an example of it right here.
What if Abraham had not been willing to offer Isaac? What if Abraham had just said, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm just not doing that. You have to think that the covenant's broken, right? Think later. God made a covenant with the nation of Israel. They broke the covenant. When they broke their end of the agreement, God did not carry out his end of the agreement, because a covenant, as we said, takes two parties. And so I think here in the case of Abraham, we see again that notion of covenant. That's a good place to break. We'll break right there, and we'll begin with chapter 23 next week, Lord willing.